Back when I was in high school, my friends and I used to spend a lot of our weekends hanging out at this massive old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It wasn't just a regular graveyard, though. The cemetery grounds spanned across acres of thick, dense woods. Naturally, being the restless teenagers we were, we'd wait until late at night, sneak onto the property, and just find a quiet spot to post up and chill. Most of the time, we'd stay near the main grounds, but every now and then, usually on special occasions, like when we managed to convince some girls from our class to come along, we'd explore a little further into the tree line. We never went too deep, though. Once you stepped under those trees, it was pitch black. Now, there's one specific night from back then that I still think about to this day. Honestly, I can't explain what actually happened out there, but without a doubt, it was the single scariest moment of my entire life. It was a group of 6 of us that night. Me, my 2 best friends, and 3 girls from our grade. I'd managed to score a few things for the hangout that weren't exactly legal for kids our age, which helped sweeten the deal to get the girls to come out with us. Among them was a girl I'll call Jane. I had a huge crush on Jane, but she never really saw me that way. So that night, I was trying way too hard to play it cool and impress her. As the night wore on, Jane randomly decided she wanted to go explore the woods surrounding the cemetery. The rest of the group was pretty hesitant. The woods were massive, pitch black, and going in there in the middle of the night just felt like a terrible idea. But being the weak-minded guy I was when it came to a crush, it didn't take much for Jane to talk me into it. I mean, when the girl you like asks you to walk into the dark woods with her, you don't think twice. You just say yes. My buddies played good wingmen and convinced Jane's 2 friends to stay behind with them, giving us some space. So Jane and I set off into the tree line alone. She was acting kind of strange as we walked. She kept talking about local legends, dark rituals, and lost souls. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just nodded along, trying to play it cool and enjoy the moment. Because of how dense the canopy was, it was almost impossible to see where we were stepping. We were walking through a part of the cemetery grounds I'd never seen before. It was actually kind of tragic. Tucked deep into the woods were these ancient, forgotten graves. Nature had completely reclaimed them. The gravestones were crumbling, covered with thick moss and rotting leaves, and the names carved into the stone were barely readable. I had no idea there were graves all the way back here. But the hidden graves weren't the only thing waiting for us out there. As we pushed even deeper into the brush, a structure started to shape through the trees. At first, I thought it was just a large mausoleum, but as we got closer and cleared the branches, I couldn't believe my eyes. It was a small, abandoned church, completely swallowed by the woods. Jane immediately stopped in her tracks. She started rambling about how we shouldn't be there, whispering that we might disturb the spirits resting inside. I tried to be respectful of her feelings, but honestly, I thought she was just being paranoid. I spent a few minutes convincing her that nothing bad was going to happen, and she finally agreed to walk up to it with me. The front entrance had 2 heavy wooden double doors, chained shut with a rusted padlock. I could tell Jane was getting genuinely unnerved, but instead of backing off, I decided this was my moment to act brave. I threw my weight against the double doors a few times. On the 3rd hit, the rotting wood around the hinge snapped, and the door swung open with a heavy thud. I stepped inside, and man, it was surreal. The air was thick with dust and decay. There were about 7 or 8 rows of rotting wooden pews leading up to a small altar at the far end, with old Bibles scattered across the floor.
Jane stood right at the threshold, begging me to come back out, but I was leaning into the act. I walked straight down the center aisle, stood behind the altar, and started doing this over-the-top, disrespectful preacher impression to make her laugh. She wasn't amused, and a second later, I got exactly what I deserved.
I took one step backward, and the floorboards behind the altar gave out completely. The rotting wood snapped beneath my feet, and I went free-falling into total darkness. It was about a 10-foot drop straight down onto a rock-hard crawlspace floor. The impact knocked the wind right out of me, sending a sharp wave of pain through my body. Hearing the crash, Jane forgot all about her fear and ran over to the hole, yelling down to see if I was okay. I shouted back that I was alive, even though my back was throbbing. I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. The beam was weak, but it gave me enough light to inspect my surroundings. Right next to the hole, I noticed the remnants of a wooden ladder that had once been used to climb up and down from the crawl space, but it was completely rotted and broken beyond repair. I told Jane to run back to the cemetery entrance and get my friends. She didn't want to leave me down there alone, but I insisted. After a brief argument, I heard her footsteps fading away as she ran out the front doors. I pulled out my phone to call my buddies directly, but naturally I had zero service down there, so I was left waiting in the dark. I decided to sweep my flashlight around the crawl space to see if there was another way out. I hesitated at first. I'm terrified of spiders, and a damp, abandoned cellar felt like spider heaven. At first glance, it just looked like a low-ceilinged room supported by heavy wooden beams. I walked over to the broken ladder to see if I could somehow piece it together, but it just crumbled in my hands. And that's when I heard it. A faint noise echoed from the far corner of the room behind me. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It sounded like something dragging itself across the dirt, a slow, rhythmic shuffling. I froze. My heart sank into my stomach. I slowly turned around and swept the beam of my phone light toward the opposite end of the space. Nothing. Just as I was about to lower the light, something caught the edge of my vision. I aimed the light at the dirt ground near one of the central wooden support pillars. The dirt near the base of the pillar looked fresh, like it had just been disturbed. I couldn't say for sure if it was like that before I fell, but a wave of absolute dread washed over me. I was trapped in a hole in an abandoned church deep in the woods at 2 in the morning. Panic set in. I turned back to the opening above me and started screaming at the top of my lungs for my friends to hurry up. And right in the middle of my shouting, I heard it again. This time, it was a heavy guttural rasp, a low human grunt right in the darkness ahead of me. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to look, but I couldn't help it. I raised my phone light one more time and flashed it toward the noise. What I saw made my blood run cold. Staring directly back at me from the dirt floor was a man. The dim light bounced off his completely bald head. He had these wide, wild, unblinking eyes that felt like they were staring right through my soul. He was flat on the ground, and I kid you not, he started crawling toward me. He wasn't running, he was dragging his body across the dirt, shuffling closer and closer with terrifying speed. I completely lost it. I backed up against the cold foundation wall, hyperventilating and screaming for help. Just as he was only a few feet away, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps slamming onto the church floor above. My friends had arrived.
One of my buddies looked over the edge of the hole, saw the horror on my face, and immediately grabbed a huge, thick tree branch from outside, dropping it down into the drop zone. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed onto that branch and scrambled up for dear life. I could hear the wood groaning and snapping under my weight with every inch I climbed, but by some miracle it held long enough for my friends to grab my arms and hoist me out. I collapsed onto the church floor, trembling, crying and yelling that there was somebody down there. My friends thought I was losing my mind, but they leaned over the hole with their flashlights anyway, and they saw him. Only this time, he wasn't crawling toward the hole anymore. He was slowly dragging himself backward, retreating into the pitch-black shadow behind the pillar. One of my buddies wanted to call the cops, thinking the guy might be hurt or stranded, but the rest of us were so thoroughly unnerved that we just ran. We sprinted all the way out of those woods and didn't stop until we reached our cars. Before we left the church, though, I did kick the tree branch back down the hole, just in case he really did need help getting out. For the next 2 days, the guilt consumed me. I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking that maybe we had abandoned a poor, injured homeless guy to starve in the dark. So, 2 nights later, I built up the courage to go back. I drove to the cemetery alone during the day, walked into the woods, and found the church. When I stepped inside, my heart dropped. The massive tree branch I had kicked down the hole was no longer down there. It was lying neatly on the church floor, resting right beside one of the wooden pews. I pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight I'd brought with me and shone it down into the crawl space, calling out into the dark. Silence. There was no sign of the man anywhere. A wave of relief washed over me, knowing the guy wasn't dead down there, but that relief was instantly replaced by pure terror. I had no idea who that man was. I had no idea how he got inside a locked church in the middle of nowhere. And most disturbingly, I had no idea where he went. We never went back to those cemetery woods again. I moved away from that town years ago, but whenever I go back home to visit my parents, I think about taking a drive back out there to check on that church. Only this time, I pray I don't find anyone waiting for me.
The next story. About 2 years ago, my grandmother passed away. It hit me way harder than I could have ever imagined. She was easily the most important person in my life. In a lot of ways, she was more of a parent to me than my actual parents ever were. Whenever I went through rock-bottom moments in my life, she was the only one who stood by me and helped me get back on track. Honestly, I owe pretty much all of my success in life to her. She had been sick for a while before she passed, but she kept that completely hidden from me because she knew how much I'd worry about her. About a month after her funeral, I started visiting her grave at the local cemetery after work every day. I'd just sit there by her tombstone and talk to her. It was my own personal form of meditation. It was the only place where I felt a genuine sense of peace amidst all the grief. Unfortunately, that peace wouldn't last for very long. One afternoon, while I was visiting my grandma, I noticed a strange woman standing at a plot just 2 graves down from ours. Objectively speaking, she looked normal enough, but there was just something deeply unsettling about her energy. You know how some people just give off an immediate bad vibe? That was her. She was probably in her mid-40s, tall, really thin, with this wild, curly hair. She wasn't bad-looking, and she actually had a nice smile, but her mannerisms were completely off. She was standing over this grave, talking out loud and randomly bursting into loud laughter. Every few seconds, she'd glance over in my direction.
Whenever she caught me looking, she'd just smile and say something like, "Don't mind me, I'm just chatting with George." I assumed George was the name of her late husband or relative on the tombstone. I'd just smile politely, nod, and go back to what I was doing. People talk to their deceased loved ones in cemeteries all the time, so that wasn't the weird part. It was the volume of her voice and the way she would laugh hysterically, like she had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Before long, I started noticing this woman every single day. It started getting really annoying. Whenever I pulled into the cemetery, she was already there, almost as if she were waiting for me. The second I got out of my car, she waved frantically and greeted me by my first name. I had no idea how she even knew who I was. Visiting my grandma was supposed to be a private, sacred time for me, and I felt like this woman was completely ruining it. One afternoon, she finally walked over to my grandma's plot to talk to me directly. She apologized for being so loud and explained that when her loved one passed away, it completely shattered her. Naturally, being in the exact same boat, I sympathized with her. We ended up talking for a while. She got me talking about my grandma, and I opened up about who she was and how much she meant to me. I told her how my grandma had lived less than 2 miles from this cemetery her entire life, and then I accidentally made a huge mistake. I honestly don't know why I shared that. Sometimes when you're grieving and connecting with someone, you just overshare information you really shouldn't.
After that conversation, I realized I had made a terrible mistake. I was terrified that because we had a real chat, she was going to try to talk to me every single day. To me, that sounded like a total nightmare. So I decided to switch up my visiting schedule. Instead of going after work on weekdays, I waited until Saturday afternoon. When I pulled up to my grandma's plot that Saturday, I was finally alone. The woman was nowhere in sight. However, as I was driving toward the far exit to leave, I spotted her sitting at a completely different grave on the other side of the cemetery, talking to another visitor. Instead of being creeped out, I actually felt bad for her. I figured she was just a deeply lonely, grieving soul who used the cemetery as a weird, desperate way to meet people. That night, I went out for drinks with some out-of-town friends. By the time I headed home, it was past 1 a.m. Since I'd been drinking, I took an Uber back to my house. I was exhausted and couldn't wait to just crash. The Uber dropped me off, and as I walked up my driveway, I noticed something strange. A faint light was shining through the window blinds of my house. Now, that might not sound weird to most people, but I am notorious for turning off every single light before I leave the house. I never leave lights on. Right then and there, I knew something was horribly wrong. So, instead of calling the police like a normal person, I decided to check it out myself. I quietly unlocked the front door and stepped inside. As soon as I walked in, I could hear faint shuffling coming from my bedroom. It sounded like someone going through my drawers. Panic set in. I quietly crept over to the hallway and hid behind a door, peeking through the crack to see what was happening. I wanted to pull out my phone and call 911, but I was so petrified of making a sound that my body completely froze. And then she walked out of my bedroom. It was the strange woman from the cemetery. She was holding a framed childhood photo of me that used to sit on my grandmother's nightstand. She started walking right down the hallway, passing just inches from the door I was hiding behind. I slammed both hands over my mouth to smother the sound of my heavy breathing. She walked into the living room and sat down on the couch. From my hiding spot, I could just barely see her side profile.
And then she started talking out loud, having a full-blown conversation with George, just like she did at the cemetery. What happened next sent cold shivers down my spine. Her tone suddenly shifted. She started laughing hysterically at nothing, stopped abruptly, and then let out this blood-curdling scream. Right after the scream, she just stared blankly into the distance and broke out into uncontrollable sobbing. I was helpless, frozen in terror. This woman was severely mentally unstable, and I had no idea if she was armed or dangerous.
Right in the middle of another sobbing fit, she abruptly stood up, looked at the empty air beside her, and said, "It's time to go. We don't want to make him upset." She looked around the room one last time, walked out of my sightline, and a second later I heard a quiet struggle near the back wall, followed by her giggling to herself. Then, total silence. I stayed frozen behind that door for another 30 minutes before I finally gathered the courage to step out. I crept into the living room, and to my massive relief, she was gone. I looked toward the far wall and saw the living room window wide open. That was how she had broken in, and the struggling noise I heard was her squeezing herself back out into the night. I locked the window immediately and called the police. When the cops arrived, we checked the house and realized she hadn't stolen a single thing. My grandmother's expensive jewelry, electronics, cash, everything was untouched. The only thing missing was that framed picture of me. The police explained that when I casually mentioned inheriting my grandmother's house, she must have tracked down my address using public property records. A few days later, I went back to the cemetery. The woman wasn't there, but I walked over to the tombstone she used to stand at. The name on the grave wasn't George. It wasn't even close. She had been pretending to talk to a dead loved one at a total stranger's grave. I've never seen that woman again, but to this day, every time I pull into that cemetery to visit my grandmother, I am constantly checking my rearview mirror. And the one thought that keeps me up at night is wondering why out of everything in my house she only took that picture of me. The next story. When I was a kid, my mum and I used to take long walks through the local cemetery. It was our special routine, a simple way to get me out of the house and moving. While we walked, we'd play this silly little game. We'd look at the dates on the headstones, figure out how old the person was when they passed, and make up an entire backstory about their life. It was a weird hobby, sure, but it was our thing, and it created a really close bond between us. However, things changed as I got older. My mum and I had a massive falling out a few years ago, and we completely stopped speaking. Last year, I finally bought my very first house. It's a beautiful, secluded little place, perfect for a single guy like me, and only 15 minutes from town. The seller had dropped the price multiple times, mostly because of its location. You see, the property line sits directly on the border of an ancient cemetery. If you walk through my backyard, you literally step right onto the cemetery grounds. I always found it ironic. I spent so much of my childhood walking through graveyards with my mother, and now I had one sitting right in my backyard. It was a constant, haunting reminder of her and our broken relationship. A few months after moving in, I started going for walks in the cemetery at night. I didn't do it for any creepy or sinister reasons. I've just always felt a strange sense of peace and relaxation in graveyards. Besides, I'm a total night owl and a terrible sleeper, so walking around under the stars felt like the best way to clear my mind. Some nights I'd throw in my headphones and listen to audiobooks.
Other nights I'd just walk in complete silence. People called me crazy for wandering around a cemetery alone after dark, but I was never scared until one specific night changed everything. I was walking without headphones that night, just enjoying the quiet breeze. Out of nowhere, I thought I caught the faint sound of a voice. At first, I brushed it off, assuming it was just the wind rustling through the trees. But a second later, I heard it clear as day. Right behind me, a calm, casual voice spoke up. "Hey, Jake, it's me." My heart instantly sank into my stomach. Hearing my actual name echoed in an empty graveyard at 2 in the morning made my blood run cold. I spun around, expecting to see a ghost or someone I knew. Instead, I saw a total stranger walking toward me with a brisk, aggressive pep in his step. It was well past 2 a.m., yet this guy was wearing dark black sunglasses. He had on a dirty white t-shirt and ripped jeans. I had never seen this man in my entire life. I didn't say a word. Panic seized me, so I turned right around and started power walking in the opposite direction. I glanced back over my shoulder 3 times, and every time he was still following me, keeping pace. I wasn't about to stick around to find out what he wanted. I broke into a full sprint and ran until my lungs burned. Luckily, it worked, and I lost him in the darkness. When I finally got back home, I locked every single door and window, trembling from head to toe. The confrontation was terrifying on its own, but what horrified me most was how did a total stranger in a town I'd just moved to know my name?
For the next 2 months, I stayed completely away from the cemetery. I was horribly paranoid, constantly peeking out my back windows, expecting to see that guy standing near my fence. Eventually, though, the fear started to fade. I convinced myself it must have been a bizarre misunderstanding. Maybe he misidentified me, or maybe I just misheard him in the dark. One night, around 1 a.m., feeling reckless, I decided to go back out for a quick walk. I wandered around for about an hour without seeing a soul. I found a massive oak tree, sat down against its trunk, put one earbud in, closed my eyes, and just vibed to the music. While my eyes were shut, I felt a sudden rush of air right past my head. I snapped my eyes open and looked around, but saw nothing except dark tombstones. I assumed it was just a bat or a night bird. I kept watch for a minute, let my guard down, and closed my eyes again. And right at that exact second, someone leaned down right behind my ear and whispered, "Hey, right behind you." Before I could even react, an icy, filthy hand clutched my shoulder. I jumped out of my skin and scrambled forward. Peering out from behind the tree trunk was the exact same man, only this time his sunglasses were off. He stepped around the tree toward me, keeping his hand outstretched. His fingers were covered in something dark and reddish. I couldn't tell if it was dried mud or blood. He took another step closer and said my name again, his voice unnaturally calm. "I haven't seen you in a while, Jake." My throat went completely dry. I tried to speak, but I was paralyzed by sheer terror. What unsettled me most was the way he was moving. He wasn't walking normally. He was staggering and swaying, moving like a toddler or a broken puppet trying to remember how to walk. I didn't wait around. I turned and sprinted for my life, taking a long, roundabout path home so he wouldn't see where I lived. That
was the absolute last time I ever stepped foot in that cemetery. In the weeks that followed, I started digging into the history of the grounds. Some friends suggested he might just be a caretaker or security guard, but that made zero sense. Security guards don't stalk visitors in sunglasses at night, and they certainly don't know your name. I eventually tracked down the owner of the property, an elderly woman who served as the groundskeeper. I asked her if anyone worked on the cemetery at night. She told me absolutely not. The cemetery was ancient, no one had been buried there in decades, and she barely maintained the grounds anymore due to her age. Whoever that man was, he had no official reason to be there. Shortly after, I put up a tall privacy fence along my backyard to block off the cemetery completely. Then came the real plot twist, the part of this story that still gives me nightmares. A few months ago, the lingering shock of those encounters made me reminisce about my childhood and the good times I used to have with my mother. I decided life was too short, so I called her up to finally bury the hatchet. Thankfully, she was receptive, and we started slowly rebuilding our relationship. During one of our phone calls, I brought up the cemetery behind my house and casually told her about the bizarre guy in sunglasses who had stalked me twice. The moment I finished telling the story, my mum went completely silent. The silence dragged on for so long that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, her voice came back, sounding shaken and dead serious. "Jake, do you remember why we suddenly stopped taking our walks in the cemetery when you were little?" I paused. I don't know. I assumed I just grew out of it. She took a deep breath and said, "No. One afternoon while we were walking, a man matching that exact description, wearing black sunglasses, approached us. He greeted me by my full name and insisted we come look at his car." Hearing those words sent a cold spike of adrenaline through my entire body. My mum explained that she subtly threatened to call the police, which finally scared him off. She was so horrified by the encounter that she immediately reported him to the cops. The officers told her they had received multiple stalking reports about that exact same man targeting people in local graveyards. She never told me back then because I was just a young kid and she didn't want to terrify me. As she talked, a forgotten memory slowly resurfaced from the back of my mind, a faint recollection of a stranger whispering to my mum while I was looking at headstones, and my mum grabbing my arm and rushing us away. It hit me like a ton of bricks. The man who confronted me in the middle of the night wasn't a stranger who randomly guessed my name. He was the exact same predator who had stalked my mother and me when I was a child. He recognized me because he had been watching us all along. It's been over a year since that night. My relationship with my mum is better than ever, but I still live in that house. Every single night, I stand at my bedroom window and stare out at that privacy fence in my backyard, wondering if that man in the black sunglasses is standing in the dark on the other side, waiting for me to come back out.